Hey YouTube, how's it going? Kevin Cleary here with The View from the Pew. I want to start today's discussion by asking you this question. Do you think of yourself as a good person? Okay, now, and just think about that for a second and imagine, maybe you're answering a survey and you have to check beside your name, a good person or a bad person. And most of us are going to say, yeah, I think of myself as a pretty good person, okay? And while that's true, you will also have within your mind, your imagination, some conception of what that means. Okay, so maybe you think a good person is someone who's honest, who has integrity, who is kind, who's generous, someone who is thoughtful and puts others first. Okay, a list of things that you think of, and that are good things, good characteristics, and probably a list of bad things that you try to disassociate yourself from or try not to engage in. But here's the problem that arises when we think about that. We have this list of whatever it is that we think, hey, that's what makes me a good person. But then we'll also notice, if we're honest, that we don't always live up to the list. Okay, maybe you think of yourself that being honest is important and part of what it means to be a good person. But then you go, yeah, but there were those times that I didn't tell the truth. Or maybe, you think of that time when you didn't help someone who really did need help, and now you feel bad about that. Well, that feeling, that recognition of the disconnect that exists between what's good, and even if we just use our own definition of good and what we do, that disconnect and the feeling it creates is called guilt. Okay? And so we feel bad because we have in our minds and in our hearts this understanding of what goodness is, but then we also, if we're honest with ourselves, we realize that we don't always live up to even our own standard of goodness. Now, I'm only using that temporarily because one of the things we ought to acknowledge within this is that there is a real moral standard for good and evil that exists, okay? There are things that are really evil and things that are really good, and when you do those things, you're actually doing good or evil. Now, defining that and fully proving that is a discussion for another video, but here's the thing. Even people who would deny that there is such a thing as good and evil, guess what? They still feel guilty. So their denial is purely mental and it's not really helping them emotionally. And so we have this disconnect between what a good person is and what we are sometimes. And we've got to deal with that. Okay? So here's what I want to talk with you about. How do you deal with it? How do you reconcile this dichotomy, this problem that exists where you say, hey, this is what a good person is, this is where I am, and the two aren't quite exactly the same. And there are a number of ways that people have tried to do that. Probably first and foremost is they try to ignore it. Okay? They'll lie to themselves and say either, number one, this thing that I feel bad about, well, it's really not bad anyway, so I'm going to, just reinforce that in my mind. Sometimes they'll try to ignore it by keeping themselves busy. They feel intense feelings of guilt, so they engage in every kind of distraction you could think of, from hedonism to substance abuse to throwing themselves into work or some other pursuit, trying to ignore and be distracted from that feeling of guilt. And so those are all ways to try and sort of be distracted, to forget about it. But then there are those people who acknowledge it and they try to overcompensate. So they feel guilty, and in return or in recognition of that, they try to find some redemption, some reconciliation through their own efforts. And so maybe they devote themselves to charity, and they make sure that they're volunteering in every kind of volunteer organization you could think of, and they go out of their way to be super good all the time. Okay, and of course that becomes even more of a burden maybe than the guilt itself would be. Okay, so those are some of the ways that people have dealt with it. Some people, now this is a rare occasion, but some people embrace it. They say, yeah, it must just be that I am a bad person, that I am drawn to those things which are wrong, and so I'm just going to embrace that as a part of my identity and fully give myself over to that sort of dark side of the world and to doing things that are wrong, okay? That's a pretty rare occurrence, but from time to time that may happen. But then I would suggest that there's yet another way, okay? And that way is to acknowledge and deal with it. Okay, and here's what I mean by that. Yes, we admit that, hey, I'm not perfect. I haven't got it all figured out. I do make mistakes. I do things that are wrong. However, I also know that there is a way that can be remedied, that can be dealt with. Okay, and the way we have to deal with that is to seek forgiveness. We maybe seek forgiveness through a party that's been wrong, the person we've lied to or stolen from or hurt in some way. And that's probably, when it comes to personal relationships, that is absolutely paramount and incredibly healing and helpful in dealing with guilt. Some may say that, hey, the things that I've done in the past, I'm gonna start today and make a new start. And that's one of the ways that we may deal with guilt. And of course, there may be a person who recommits and says, yeah, I am a good person who made a mistake, and I'm going to go back and continue to be a good person. Okay, and so those options I think are the healthiest. But let me expand on this just a little and bring some spirituality into this equation. Okay, ultimately, the creator of the standard of good and evil is God. And it's ultimately God that we'll be answerable to in eternity. It's Him who is going to deal out justice when the time comes. And so the ultimate place that we need to look for forgiveness is from God, because it's His principles that we've violated. It's His truths that we have ignored. And guilt, that feeling of guilt that we feel, is something that He's given to us to help us know when we've done something wrong and to respond. It's very similar to pain in that, we feel pain and that warns us, hey, don't do that again, right? If you touch the hot stove and you pull your hand away, you go, man, stoves are not good to touch. That pain is incredibly helpful. And guilt can have a place like that, where it's helpful to say to us, hey, something is not right here. There's something you need to deal with. Okay. Now, when it comes to how that gets done, it's important that we consider some of the religious truths that exist. There are some religions who would say the only way to deal with guilt is through payback. Some would call that karma. Okay, you do something bad has to happen to you before the world balances out. Okay, some would say that you deal with that through balance. So for every bad behavior, you've got to engage in a good behavior so that the scale of your life ends up more in favor on the good side than the bad side. And there are major world religions, by the way, who hold to both of these tenets. Finally, the most appropriate, helpful, and meaningful way of dealing with guilt is to understand that there is an avenue through which we can have forgiveness, through which justice can be done, evil can be dealt with, and yet those of us who want to be good but sometimes fall into evil can realize our ultimate goal, which is to be good and right and just. And that can only happen through what God has done and through the sacrifice of His Son on the cross. You see, Jesus allows for God's justice to be carried out, for His wrath to be directed somewhere other than at me and you who rightly deserve it. Okay? And ultimately for us to be reconciled, to be truly forgiven, for the debt to be paid, and for the burden of guilt to be lifted. If you want to talk more about that, go ahead and send me either a YouTube message here or email me, clearkevin@gmail.com. If you're local, come over to the church or go on our Facebook page, okay, and get in touch that way. But I want to make a very important point right now, and that is this. We live in a world that tries to do everything to eliminate guilt, to get away from it, to forget about it, to act as if it's not really there. But that's not helping anyone, okay? The only way to truly help anyone or to help ourselves is to admit that, yeah, we do wrong sometimes, but to understand that there's a God who loves us and who has done what needs to be done to deal with that guilt and that wrongdoing. I hope you'll give this careful consideration, and I hope when you hear when you hear the trends of our culture trying to rid themselves of their feelings of guilt through denial, you'll identify that for what it is and you'll reject it. And rather, you'll understand that guilt is a helpful thing that can drive us back to what's right and ultimately back to the source of all that's right, which is to a relationship with God. Hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. That's The View from the Pew.